Introduction by Governor Carpenter. These introductory remarks were furnished by the Honorable C.C. Carpenter at the special request of the historian. Their appearance in this volume needs no apology or explanation. Himself a pioneer among the men of this regiment, a volunteer in the service, no man better understands the facts of which he writes. Quote, "The fall of 1862 was the darkest period of the Civil War. The campaign of McClellan on the Virginia Peninsula, in front of Richmond, had resulted in several drawn battles, and in the final withdrawal of the Army of the Potomac to the vicinity of Washington from an almost besieged situation at Harrison's Landing, the army under Grant in the Mississippi Valley, whilst holding its own, had been employed in comparatively fruitless skirmishes, and had fought two severe battles at Corinth and Luka to hold the territory which had been acquired by the brilliant campaigns against Fort Donelson and on the bloody battlefield of Shiloh. The Army of the Cumberland, under Buell, had engaged in a foot race with the rebel army under Bragg, each marching on parallel roads, the rebels intent on reaching the Ohio River and assailing Buell's communications by capturing Louisville and his depots of supply, whilst the Union Army was putting forth its best efforts solely to foil this attempt of its adversary. The fall elections in the North, as interpreted by those not in sympathy with the war measures of the government, had been a vote of want of confidence in the policy of the administration. In the face of all these discouragements, the President called for additional forces. The meager knowledge of what was meant when the first regiments took the field was no longer an element to be counted upon in securing enlistments. The first flush of excitement after the fall of Sumter had been succeeded by the sober second thought. The long lists of killed and wounded, the pathetic reports from the hospitals, the accounts of suffering on the march and in the storms of the natural elements, and the fiercer storms of the battle had chilled the hot blood of the earlier months of the war. The men who made up the new regiments were not ignorant of the reception which awaited them at the front. Among these regiments was the 32nd Iowa Infantry. It is doubtless true that the men who comprised this regiment had occasion to feel the seriousness of the chances of war in equal measure to those of any regiment which entered the service from Iowa. They were mostly men of mature years and ripe judgment. Many of them were the heads of young families. A large proportion of them were men who had left the states further east and sought a home on the frontier in accordance with a cherished idea of securing an independence. The war found them upon the threshold of their new enterprises, with a newly purchased farm or a newly established business, upon which perhaps were encumbrances involving their interest and their honor. Their enlistment also involved leaving families and friends in a new country with half-completed homes and meager improvements. And yet, arising above all these considerations which bound them to their homes, the young husband left his young wife, sons left their parents, brothers left sisters, and lovers left their loved ones, to go out and take the chances and endure the hardships of the soldier. There were localities within the territory from which the 32nd Regiment was raised where hardly an able-bodied man remained at home. The women and children toiled in the field, husked the corn, cared for the stock, and plowed the soil, until the men who survived the vicissitudes of the camp and battlefield returned to the fireside which had been kept aglow by a devoted wife, mother, or sister. The man who enlisted under the circumstances existing when the 32nd Infantry was called into the field carried a thinking bayonet. They left homes of intelligence, stimulated solely by a moral purpose. The Bible lay on the center table. Books, magazines, and newspapers, well handled and well read, indicated the character and principles of these households. It was not a spirit of adventure that influenced the young men in these homes to bear the realities of the camp and the battle. It was a sense of duty and patriotic attachment to the principle. It was with such men and from such homes the ranks of the 32nd Iowa Infantry were filled. The writer had a conversation with a young soldier late in October 1862 who in his boyhood had been one of his pupils in a country school. Although he was not a 32nd Iowa man, yet he was typical of the soldiers of that regiment. It was a few days after the Battle of Corinth when we met for the first time in many years. The meeting and the greeting can be imagined better than told. Then, for some hours, there was a running tire of conversation. "Are you married?" the writer inquired. "Yes, I've been married 5 years and have 2 children." "It must have been a pretty severe trial for you to leave home and become a soldier." "Trial," said he, "is no name for it. It was the next thing to death itself." Then he went on to say, "When the war began, I said to my wife, I believe I ought to enlist. Some people say that we who voted for Lincoln are responsible for the war, and if that is true, I ought to accept my share of the responsibility." But she replied, "You have a wife and 2 helpless children to care for, and very little to leave them should you not return. It is not necessary for you to go when there are so many others, not encumbered as you are, who are ready to go." I argued with her that if anything should befall me, the government would take care of her. But she was incorrigible, and I dropped the subject. Months passed. The Battle of Bull Run had been fought. Other battles had taken place, and it was evident that the war was not to be a holiday. The call for reinforcements was not responded to with the original alacrity. New regiments were hard to raise. Finally, I broached the subject again. I found she had been thinking about it, and she said, the tears filling her eyes, and her accent thick with emotion, "Well, this evidently is going to be a long war, and I have made up my mind that the women as well as the men must make great sacrifices. And as you are young and strong and healthy, I don't know but it is your duty to enlist." That settled the question, and here I am. I have told this story to illustrate the mental evolution which antedated the enlistment of thousands and thousands of soldiers when struggling with the question of their personal duty. This was an ideal soldier from an ideal American home, fighting for an ideal country. Who will question that story does not repeat the history, the antecedent to entering the service, of a large majority of the members of the 32nd Iowa Infantry. If the conversation was not with a wife, it was with a father and mother, or with a sister or a loved one. In how many of these frontier and half-finished homes were there 2 sons with old and helpless parents? The question was settled that at least one of them should go into the service, and then with patriotic unselfishness, the subject was canvassed as to which son was best equipped in health, endurance, and character to meet the vicissitudes of the camp, the march, and the battle. The writer well remembers reading in a newspaper which reached him in the South at the time the question of raising the 32nd Iowa Infantry was being agitated, the synopsis of an address by Colonel Scott urging enlistments. This newspaper was the Hamilton Freeman, where its editor, Charles Aldrich, subsequently locked up his printing office and went into the regiment as its adjutant. Colonel Scott had seen service not only in the Mexican War, but in the 3rd Iowa Infantry, and knew that war was a serious business. But he in no manner attempted to soften its terrors. He did not promise the men who should enlist immunity from danger or from hardship or from deprivation. He did not hold out them the prospect of fame. He did not minify the sacrifices of leaving home. The only promises he made them were that they would have long marches, that they would swelter beneath southern suns, that they would sometimes have scant food, and that they would often thirst for a draught of cold water, and that they would be called to stand on picket and to lie in trenches confronting the enemy, and that the only thing of which they would never lack a full supply would be hard and dangerous service. But notwithstanding all this, the regiment was filled because he appealed to men who are ready to go where duty called. The writer knew of many soldiers who constituted the rank and file of this splendid regiment, and he will be excused for briefly recalling some of the characteristics of a few who are among the fallen and whose names are an inspiring memory to their comrades who still survive. It is doubtful if there was in the service a more lion-hearted man than Major Jonathan Hutchison. It is tradition at his old home that when the patriotic citizens assembled to consider the subject of raising a company for this regiment in Fort Dodge and vicinity, his speech was the most effective that was made. Briefly and simply, he said, "Uncle Sam has a big job on hand, and I'm going to help him through it." The men who enlisted at Fort Dodge and vicinity were worthy followers of their captain. The story is told of Alexander Dowd that when at New Madrid, whilst was executing an order of the brigade commander, not one of the 32nd Iowa Infantry, to spike the cannon and throw them into the Mississippi River to prevent them from falling into the hands of Marmaduke, who was approaching with a superior force, he, believing that the detachment at New Madrid could defend their position, declared as he was driving home a spike that this thing would be thrown up to the young Dowds at Dayton 100 years from that time. One of the truest men the writer ever knew as a citizen and professional man was Dr. Stephen B. Olney, the surgeon of the regiment. What he was in the military service is sufficiently attested by the tenderness with which his name is mentioned by every surviving soldier of the regiment. Among the noble men who fell at Pleasant Hill was Captain Amos B. Miller. He was a gentleman in every fiber of his nature and a man of the most generous and patriotic impulses. He became a soldier because he believed it was his duty he owed to his country. The spirit of self-sacrifice which prompted him to enter the service, notwithstanding his contemplative habit of mind, his love of books and civil employment, led him to meet all the requirements of the service with resolute will and unfaltering fidelity, crowning all in death on the field of battle. Lieutenant Adjutant Huntley, a young man with a bright promise of usefulness and distinction, who entered the service by the side of Captain Miller, died upon the same battlefield. These were types of the entire regiment and have been mentioned here because they were known to the writer and illustrate the character of the men who constituted the 32nd Iowa Infantry. The publication of a history of the 32nd Iowa Infantry is a most praiseworthy enterprise of its surviving comrades. Those who have a personal interest in this history will be able to verify its accuracy and impartiality. It is scarcely necessary to say that the committee appointed to supervise this publication have a difficult task to perform. Much of the matter, aside from the official records which will make up this history, must be secured from the memory of all living witnesses 30 years after the events which they are expected to recall have transpired. At all the reunions of the surviving soldiers of the rebellion, since Appomattox, regiments, and other initial organizations have been encouraged to compile their histories and live over again in the printed pages the events of their service. The future historian of the Great Rebellion, who goes outside of the cold and often meager official records, will find his richest veins of truth in the hereto unworked mines of regimental history. What member of the 32nd Iowa Infantry is willing that the future history of their struggle in the Battle of Pleasant Hill shall rest solely upon the meager reports of brigade and division commanders who were neither with them nor near them in the supremest hour of their heroic courage and self-renunciation? The history of this noble regiment will not only be read with interest by its survivors, nor alone by the historian delving for facts with which to enrich his pages, nor by the descendants of the men who constituted the regiment, but it will be read by all the citizens throughout this section of the state which was honored to make such a contribution as the Iowa 32nd Volunteer Infantry to the cause of free government." Unquote.